Between 1942 and 1943, the German High Command accumulated irrefutable technical evidence that the war could no longer be won. Reports from the OKW and the General Staff showed casualty figures, industrial productions, and logistics that made victory a mathematical impossibility. While the divisions in the east consumed more personnel than could be replaced, the Kriegsmarine lost submarines at an unsustainable rate, and the Luftwaffe faced an Allied air superiority that destroyed the Reich's productive capabilities. The generals of the General Staff knew these facts months before Hitler recognized the magnitude of the disaster. But why did they continue obeying? When did they know exactly that everything was lost? How does one continue a war knowing that it cannot be won? The turning point, when victory is no longer possible. German military planning for the campaign against the Soviet Union was developed under the assumption that the conflict would be short and would replicate the patterns of previous offensives. The doctrinal structure of the Wehrmacht remained focused on fast-paced operations aimed at dislocating the enemy before it reached full industrial and human mobilization. This concept had been validated in Poland in 1939, in Denmark and Norway in 1940, and later in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France that same year, as well as in Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941. Previous successes had reinforced the idea that a rapid attack against the Soviet Union would produce a similar operational collapse, especially if most of the Soviet forces were destroyed near the border before they could reorganize in depth. Operation Barbarossa, initiated on the 22nd of June of 1941, was conceived as the culmination of that experience. The initial deployment surpassed any previous operation both in magnitude and ambition. Nearly 3,800,000 military personnel from the Axis powers simultaneously crossed a line of more than 2,900 kilometers, supported by approximately 3,000 tanks, more than 7,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. The objective declared three main axes. Army Group North would advance towards Leningrad, Army Group Center would be directed towards Smolensk and subsequently Moscow, and Army Group South would concentrate on Ukraine. The German High Command assessed that the initial destruction of Soviet forces in the border sectors would allow for continuous advancement into the interior before the autumn of 1941. During the first weeks, the operation seemed to align with the German strategic forecast. The Luftwaffe destroyed a significant number of Soviet aircraft on the ground during the first few hours of the attack, and the German mechanized units executed deep penetration maneuvers that created several encirclement pockets. Army Group Center took Smolensk in mid-July, opening the path to Moscow. The numbers of Soviet prisoners rose to hundreds of thousands in the first months, reflecting the speed with which the Germans dismantled enemy formations. In the reports presented to the OKH, commanders emphasized that Soviet resistance appeared fragmented and that operations continued at a favorable pace. Franzo Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, maintained throughout July his conviction that the campaign was unfolding as planned. However, as the summer progressed, the first signs of a mismatch between initial planning and operational reality emerged. The resistance within the encircled pockets lasted longer than expected, forcing a diversion of units intended for the main advance. The prolongation of combat in Naim, several strongholds forced the dispersion of forces that, according to the plan, were to remain in constant motion. The number of Soviet divisions identified far exceeded the initial intelligence estimates, which calculated around 200 divisions available. By the end of July 1941, OKH records documented the emergence of new Soviet formations that were replacing previously destroyed units with surprising speed. Halder's diary, particularly the entry from the 11th of August, constitutes a technical record of the change in perception within the General Staff. He acknowledged that the initial forecasts had underestimated the volume of Soviet forces available. The identification of more than 360 Soviet divisions in different degrees of organization evidenced that the Red Army possessed a replacement capacity far superior to that initially considered. Halder also noted that, although many of these formations presented deficiencies in armament and tactical leadership, their mere existence implied the prolongation of the conflict and a substantial increase in logistical and operational demands on the German forces. The German advance into the interior of Soviet territory amplified logistical problems. The supply lines extended more than 600 kilometers from the starting points, which caused constant delays in the delivery of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The difference between the Soviet and German railway gauges required adapting captured infrastructure before use, a slow process that reduced transport capacity at a critical moment. Furthermore, the Soviet road network, composed largely of unpaved roads, quickly degraded with seasonal rains, affecting the mobility of vehicles. In several sectors, the relationship between daily transportation needs and the actual capacity of available trains began to deteriorate structurally. Reports from the autumn of 1941 recorded that frontline units required around 120 trains daily to maintain operational pace, but the actual figure rarely exceeded 100. The Soviet Union also reacted by relocating its industry. Entire factories were dismantled and sent by rail to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, where they resumed the production of weaponry and equipment. This process, initiated even before the invasion, allowed the Red Army to receive a constant flow of reinforcements. The arrival of units from Siberia, trained to operate in winter conditions, intensified during the fall. The Soviet geographical depth, combined with its ability to reorganize productive and military structures, altered the fundamental hypothesis of German planning, based on a rapid collapse of the adversary. The advance towards Moscow in the autumn of 1941 represented the moment of greatest tension between the German expectation and the real evolution of the front. The units of Army Group Center managed to approach areas from which they could observe the city. The town of Khimki, located a few kilometers from the Kremlin, was reached by advanced reconnaissance elements. However, the German forces had reached this point in conditions that hindered the continuation of the offensive. The Wehrmacht had not been equipped for prolonged winter operations, and the sharp drop in temperatures caused failures in engines, weapons, and various equipment. The frostbite casualties exceeded those produced by direct combat in some sectors, reducing the operational capacity of the units. On the 5th of December, Halder's entry reflected the critical state of the front. Army Group Center considered it unsustainable to continue the offensive due to the exhaustion of its formations. That same day, the Soviet Union launched a large-scale counter-offensive led by Georgy Zhukov. The Soviet forces, adequately equipped for the winter and reinforced by units transferred from the east, managed to break the German line at several points. Between December of 1941 and January of 1942, the Germans were pushed between 100 and 250 kilometers to the west, abandoning material that could not be recovered and reorganizing their defensive lines under constant pressure. The reversal of the operational situation had an immediate impact on the command structure. On the 19th of December of 1941, Hitler dismissed Walter von Brauchitsch and personally assumed command of the army. The centralization of operational decisions under direct political control intensified the gap between the technical assessments of the General Staff and the directives issued from the top of the regime. Reports prepared at the end of 1941 showed a significant deterioration in German combat strength. Internal estimates accounted for more than 830,000 casualties accumulated since the beginning of the operation. The divisions, originally projected for brief campaigns, maintained forces well below their nominal allocations. The viability of the German strategy began to be assessed in terms of actual capacity and not declared objectives. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht faced a scenario that its doctrine considered inadequate: a prolonged war on multiple fronts. In addition to the Soviet Union, Germany maintained military commitments in North Africa, in the Atlantic, and in the defense of European territory against the intensification of Allied bombings. The figures for production, transport, and replacement showed a trend that made it difficult to sustain an extended conflict without a deep industrial reorganization. Despite the results of the winter, a new offensive was designed for 1942 Fall Blau. The objective was to secure the oil resources of the Caucasus and decisively strike the Soviet southern front. German planners insisted on estimates that, once again, considered the adversary weakened. However, internal reports recorded reservations regarding the ability to achieve a decisive victory. The difference between the technical language of these documents and the operational decisions adopted reflected a growing dissociation in the German command. Towards the end of 1942, the mismatch between military analysis and political leadership was already a structural feature of the German command system. The calculations on force availability, industrial capacity, and front-line status contrasted with orders to continue offensives that exceeded the available resources. This gap would mark the development of the conflict in the following years, establishing a trend in which the material feasibility of the war progressively diverged from the strategic objectives that continued to be pursued. The Eastern Front, the war measured in distances. The failure of the German offensive near Moscow in December of 1941 forced the High Command to reconsider the strategic parameters of the campaign. Until that moment, the operational doctrine of the Wehrmacht had revolved around decisive blows that would destroy the adversary in a short period. However, after the events of the winter, internal analyses began to reflect a different assessment. The possibility of a rapid collapse of the Soviet system had disappeared, and the war would develop within a framework of prolonged attrition. The planning for 1942 was built on this altered premise, although still under the expectation of achieving an operational objective that would compensate for the loss of strategic initiative. The discussions between OKH planners and economic advisors to the regime agreed that the southern sector of the front offered the only possibility of obtaining a significant result. The Soviet Union partly depended on Caucasus oil, and capturing these resources could reduce its ability to sustain long-term operations. This assessment, although later contradicted by the fact that the Soviets maintained production and the war effort without losing the Caucasian oil fields, defined the German operational orientation in 1942. The new campaign was to focus on a deep push southwards to secure the Volga and approach oil regions that Germany considered essential for its own war effort. The strategic change involved recognizing that the Soviet Union had mobilized a greater military capacity than anticipated. German estimates, which in 1941 calculated they would face approximately 200 Soviet divisions, rose to account for more than 360 at the beginning of 1942. OKH operational documents recorded that the Red Army had suffered more than 4 million casualties between 1941 and early 1942, but continued to generate new formations. In contrast, German forces accumulated around 1,150,000 casualties during the same period, a figure that evidenced the growing pressure on the Reich's replacement capacity. The loss ratio remained favorable to Germany in statistical terms, but the Soviet ability to absorb them altered any direct comparison. The calculation of operational wear became a central variable for the General Staff. The analysis of intensive combats on the Eastern Front showed that the divisions involved could lose between 1% and 3% of their strength daily during continuous operations. A standard German division began its operations with around 12,000 personnel. At the observed wear rate, it could lose an average of about 1.8% per day. German tactical performance remained high, with subsequent studies indicating that the effectiveness of a German soldier remained superior to that of a Soviet soldier, even in the later stages of the war. However, this qualitative advantage did not compensate for the Soviet numerical superiority, nor their ability to replenish forces at a sustained rate. The German logistics system faced challenges that worsened as the distances involved increased. Soviet railways had to be adapted to the German gauge before they could be used, a process that delayed the transportation of supplies. The secondary roads, in many cases unpaved, became impassable during the Rasputitsa, the period of thaw and rains that turned routes into natural barriers for vehicles and transport. Reports from the OKH estimated that normal operations on the front required a minimum of 120 supply trains daily, but the actual availability rarely exceeded 100 trains. This seemingly modest difference created accumulated deficits in fuel, ammunition, and spare parts that then directly affected operational execution capability. The winter of 1941–1942 also showed structural limitations of the German equipment. The extreme temperatures caused failures in engines, automatic weapons, and armored vehicles, while the lack of winter clothing contributed to a significant increase in frostbite casualties. The Wehrmacht had not been prepared for prolonged operations in winter conditions because the original planning assumed a quick conclusion to the campaign. In contrast, the Soviet troops were trained and equipped to operate in extremely low temperatures, and the units coming from Siberia demonstrated a remarkable ability to maneuver in the snow. Soviet industrial capacity was reorganized in a way that contradicted German expectations. Entire factories were moved away from the combat zone, resuming production in the east of the country. The scale of this industrial mobilization, documented by German intelligence, allowed the Soviet Union to replenish losses of material and personnel with a speed that Germany could not match. The geographic depth of Soviet territory allowed its forces to withdraw, regroup, and return to combat without suffering a structural collapse, something any Western European state would have considered unsustainable. The summer offensive of 1942, Fall Blau, reflected this set of realities. The German advance south sought to secure the Volga and approach the Caucasian oil fields. By the end of August, the German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, reached Stalingrad. Luftflotte 4 carried out a massive bombing on the 23rd of August, destroying a large part of the city and causing numerous civilian casualties. The battle that followed was a prolonged process in which the German forces progressed slowly, facing an improvised but persistent defensive system. Urban combat in Stalingrad consumed considerable resources. As the weeks passed, the German units found themselves engaged in close-range encounters in destroyed urban environments. By mid-November, the Sixth Army had managed to push Soviet forces towards the western bank of the Volga, but failed to eliminate them completely. The accumulated attrition significantly reduced their offensive capability. The flanks of the Sixth Army, mostly defended by Romanian and Hungarian units, represented a vulnerable point. On the 19th of November 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, a pincer offensive aimed at encircling the German forces in Stalingrad. The Soviet advance quickly overwhelmed the Romanian and Hungarian positions. By the 22nd of November, approximately 290,000 Axis soldiers were surrounded in the city. This encirclement established a highly complex operational situation in which the Sixth Army depended entirely on air resupply. The actual capacity of the Luftwaffe to sustain the supply to the pocket was significantly less than required. Although the Air Command estimated that 500 tons of supplies needed to be delivered daily to maintain the operability of the Sixth Army, the actual figures rarely exceeded a fraction of that amount. The winter weather, Soviet anti-aircraft activity, and the progressive loss of air control hindered transport operations. As the weeks went by, the troops within the encirclement began to suffer severe shortages of food, ammunition, and fuel. The rescue attempt launched by Army Group Don under the command of Erich von Manstein advanced a considerable distance, but it failed to break the encirclement. The units inside Stalingrad requested authorization to attempt a breakout towards the German lines, but the orders to hold the position remained. The situation inside the pocket deteriorated even further during January of 1943. On the 31st of January, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The next day, the remnants of the Sixth Army capitulated. Approximately 91,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner. Of them, only between 5,000 and 6,000 returned to Germany in the decade after the war. The magnitude of the losses in Stalingrad definitively altered the balance of the Eastern Front. It is estimated that the total Axis casualties in the campaign, including the operations before and after the encirclement, exceeded 800,000. Soviet figures were also high, but the Red Army retained the ability to launch offensives after the fall of the city. The comparative analysis of industrial production and mobilization showed that the Soviet Union surpassed Germany in volume of war material. Under the direction of Albert Speer, Germany significantly increased its production, but did not reach Soviet levels in tanks, artillery, or ammunition. The Battle of Kursk in July of 1943 consolidated these trends. Although the German forces inflicted high casualties on the Soviets, the differential replacement capabilities determined that Germany could not sustain an offensive of that magnitude. Kursk became the last German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht adopted a predominantly defensive posture throughout the eastern sector. The documents of the High Command of 1943 reflect an evolution in operational directives. Instead of defining decisive offensive objectives, the reports begin to refer to the need to hold the front, buy time, or inflict losses on the enemy. These formulations showed that, in professional terms, it was recognized that victory in the East was no longer achievable within the available material parameters. The accumulation of evidence on differences in production, mobilization, and human reserves led to an internal consensus. Even with improvements in German efficiency, the Reich could not match Soviet capability. The dissociation between the technical evaluation of the High Command and the political directives widened during this period. The General Staff reports identified structural limitations without an immediate solution, while the orders issued from Berlin insisted on maintaining positions regardless of their operational value. This divergence would continue to expand over the following years, conditioning the conduct of the Eastern Front until the final collapse of the regime. 3 lost oceans, the world that closed over the Reich. The initial expansion of the conflict had allowed Germany to make significant advances in continental Europe, but from 1941, the secondary theatres began to reveal a structural pattern that the German High Command could not ignore. While the Eastern Front absorbed most of the Reich's military and economic resources, the campaigns in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic clearly showed that Germany no longer controlled the global strategic environment. These spaces, defined as secondary in the initial planning, demonstrated that Germany's capacity to project and sustain operations beyond the European continent was limited by logistical and naval conditions that the Allies exploited with increasing effectiveness. By 1943, the OKW reports converged on a common diagnosis. The accumulated losses in these theatres made any possibility of reversing the global deterioration of the German strategic position unfeasible. North Africa illustrated particularly clearly the gap between tactical performance and strategic viability. The arrival of the Africa Corps in Tripoli on the 11th of February 1941 was in response to a restricted objective: to bolster Italy on a secondary front while the Wehrmacht concentrated its main power for the decisive campaign in the east. The theatre was to be maintained with a limited use of forces and without major territorial ambitions. However, the operational conduct adopted by General Erwin Rommel effectively changed the character of the campaign. Rommel interpreted that a prolonged defensive stance in North Africa would become unsustainable against a naval and logistical power like the United Kingdom, and opted to employ rapid offensives to maintain the initiative. This difference between the intended strategic purpose and the operations executed created an underlying contradiction that would influence the entire campaign. The operational environment of the desert imposed restrictions that no tactical skill could compensate for in the long term. The distance between landing ports and front lines grew with each advance, roads were limited, and the need to transport large quantities of water, fuel, and spare parts created constant pressure on convoys. The sand wore down engines and increased the breakdown rate. Internal evaluations of the Africa Corps documented that even during the most successful advances, units depended on a supply flow that never reached the required level. Half of the daily water ration intended for each soldier was used for mechanical purposes, and the available fuel directly determined the reach of operations. The situation worsened during the summer of 1942. In the month prior to the Alam Halfa offensive, a significant percentage of the fuel intended for Rommel's forces was sunk during its transit through the Mediterranean. When he launched the attack in August, he faced better supplied British forces with 700 tanks against 510 German and Italian, of which only a small fraction corresponded to German models with real capability to confront the latest generation Allied armoured vehicles. The offensive failed, largely due to the fuel shortage, and the Axis forces were forced to adopt a defensive stance. The Second Battle of El Alamein, initiated in October of 1942, developed under even less favourable conditions. The Axis forces had lost considerable amounts of supplies in September and October, and Allied interceptions of communications revealed that the German capacity to receive fuel was minimal. Meanwhile, the British forces under the command of Bernard Montgomery had abundant logistical reserves and a growing air superiority. The defeat of the Axis led to a prolonged retreat through Libya, during which Allied air pressure increased the number of losses. The Mediterranean theatre played a decisive role in this logistical degradation. The supply routes between Italy and North Africa were subjected to continuous attacks. The Royal Navy, along with British, American and Commonwealth air forces, severely hampered the transit of convoys. In April of 1943, Operation Flax destroyed a significant part of the German air transport fleet. More than 500 cargo planes that had operated from bases in Italy were forced to cease missions to Tunisia due to increasing losses and the reach of Allied fighters. The campaign left the German and Italian forces in Africa without resupply capacity. On the 7th of May 1943, Allied forces entered Tunisia, and 5 days later, 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. The African front closed with a complete loss of the forces deployed there. The Mediterranean, as a broader operational space, clearly exhibited the decline of the Axis's ability to maintain maritime communications. The Kriegsmarine, weakened by previous campaigns, could not secure supply routes, and coordination with the Italian Navy did not compensate for this deficiency. The inability to neutralize Malta, the impossibility of preventing the Allied invasion of Sicily in July of 1943 and subsequently of Italy, demonstrated that Germany relied on conditions it could no longer control. These facts showed that the Axis had lost the capability to use the Mediterranean as a strategic corridor. However, it was in the Atlantic where the German High Command faced most clearly the global consequences of this deterioration. The Battle of the Atlantic, which extended from September of 1939 to May of 1945, constituted a prolonged confrontation on which British resistance depended, and subsequently the Allied capacity to launch an offensive in Europe. During the early years of the war, German submarines achieved a level of effectiveness that endangered the continuity of Allied maritime communications. In 1942, the U-boats developed a highly successful campaign, sinking more than 3 million tons of shipping in 8 months with relatively low losses. The situation changed significantly at the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943. The deciphering of the Enigma code allowed the Allies to anticipate the movements of the U-boats and redirect convoys. The introduction of more efficient radars, long-range aircraft and anti-submarine weapons like the Hedgehog increased the Allied capacity to detect and destroy submarines. In February and March of 1943, decisive battles for the convoys were fought, in which the U-boats temporarily maintained a high offensive capacity. However, the overall trend favoured the Allies. May of 1943 represented a breaking point. During that month, the Germans lost 41 U-boats, approximately 1/4 of their operational strength. Allied losses continued to decrease, and for the first time since the beginning of the war, transatlantic convoys began to operate with a stable safety margin. Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered a temporary withdrawal of the U-boats, implicitly recognizing that the campaign had been defeated in strategic terms. The volume of sunken ships did not compensate for the losses suffered, and the fully mobilized American industrial capacity guaranteed the rapid replacement of merchant ships. The documentary evidence indicated that, in 1943, the Allies were launching millions of tons of new merchant tonnage, while Germany was losing submarines at a rate it could not sustain. The Atlantic no longer represented a favorable interdiction space for the Axis, but rather a safe maritime corridor for the transfer of troops, supplies, and industrial material that would be decisive in the preparation of the invasion of Western Europe. The OKW reports agreed that the loss of the initiative in the Atlantic had direct strategic implications. Without the ability to disrupt the sea routes between North America and Great Britain, the Allies could plan large-scale operations with logistical guarantees. The failure in the Atlantic added to the loss of North Africa and the retreat in the Mediterranean, closing the strategic space in which Germany could operate outside the European continent. These fronts, considered secondary at the start of the war, had acquired decisive weight by demonstrating that the German ability to project power depended on conditions that had ceased to exist in 1943. The convergence of these experiences allowed the High Command to synthesize a broad assessment of the situation. Even with capable commanders and tactically competent units, the German forces could not sustain prolonged operations when they lacked maritime control and faced Allied industrial production that increased every month. The American ability to build ships, escorts, and aircraft at a pace greater than the U-boats could destroy them transformed the Atlantic into a space where Germany could no longer exert influence. The analyses of the OKW integrated these observations with conclusions from the Eastern Front, confirming that the Reich faced a strategic environment that was progressively narrowing in all theaters. The generals understood that control of the sea and Allied material superiority ensured that any attempt to sustain multiple fronts simultaneously would ultimately reveal the structural limitations of the German war effort. Factories against Reich, the defeat of the assembly lines. By the end of 1942, the internal assessments of the German High Command began to increasingly incorporate a set of data that, even without expressing political judgments, indicated an irreversible trend. The analyses prepared by the OKW and the Ministry of Armaments systematically compared the available production with the frontline consumption and the accumulated losses. These documents, prepared with standard administrative procedures, showed that the demands of an industrialized war had exceeded the Reich's capacity to sustain a prolonged effort. The progressive widening of the gap between the necessary and the possible introduced a quantitative dimension to the military deterioration that became more severe with each quarter of war. The rise of Albert Speer to the Armaments Ministry in February of 1942 established a centralized framework for industrial management. Under his administration, armaments production increased significantly. This increase, later referred to as a miracle, was based on measures of administrative reorganization, process standardization, and extension of shifts. However, the comparison between what was produced and what was required showed that even substantial improvements were not enough to modify the strategic equation. Germany had entered the war without fully adapting its economy to a prolonged conflict, and the reforms implemented from 1942 faced structural limitations that no administrative process could eliminate. The reports on tank production were one of the main bases for these evaluations. In 1943, Germany manufactured approximately 11,000 tanks, a figure that represented a significant increase compared to previous years. However, the Allied powers produced much larger quantities. In that same year, the United States built close to 29,500 tanks, the Soviet Union around 20,000, and the United Kingdom more than 7,400. This disparity implied that, even considering the quality of certain German models, the overall volume of Allied material was sufficient to absorb losses and maintain constant pressure on the main fronts. The combined capacity of the United States and the Soviet Union alone surpassed any German possibility of compensating for losses at an equivalent pace. The development of the Panther tank exemplified both German technical strengths and industrial limitations. Designed in direct response to the Soviet T-34, Its production began at the end of 1942. The vehicle demonstrated superior capabilities in terms of armament and protection, but its manufacturing suffered interruptions due to administrative changes, bombing damage, and mechanical issues associated with the initial design. Planning foresaw the production of 600 units per month, but these figures were not reached. In 1943, the monthly average was approximately 148 Panthers, a figure that increased to about 315 in 1944, reaching a maximum in July. The total produced by the end of the war approached 6,000 units, far from the volume required to counter Soviet production. The Tiger and Tiger II models featured even lower figures. Between 1942 and 1944, around 1,355 Tiger Y were produced, and fewer than 500 Tiger II between 1944 and 1945. Despite the individual superiority of these vehicles in combat, their numbers were insufficient to significantly influence a conflict that depended on the massive availability of mechanized force. The complexity of the design, the manufacturing time, and the dependence on critical materials reduced the production speed, a factor that the technical reports of the Ministry of Armaments recurrently pointed out. The industrial imbalance became even more evident when considering the Allied production of aircraft. While in 1939 the United States manufactured fewer than 3,000 planes annually, the expansion programs implemented in the following years raised production to unprecedented levels. The manufacturing goals set for 1943 aimed for more than 100,000 planes, figures that would be reached and surpassed. By the end of the war, the American aerospace industry had produced approximately 300,000 planes. This included bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft that would be used in all theaters. In 1944, approximately two-thirds of the military equipment used by the Allies came from American factories. The Lend-Lease program increased this inequality. The Soviet Union received thousands of tanks, trucks, airplanes, and specialized materials, in addition to food, medical equipment, and raw materials. Half of the Soviet automotive fleet consisted of vehicles supplied by the United States and Canada. German reports on captured identified materials on the fronts acknowledged the superior quality of these vehicles and their contribution to the increased mobility of the Red Army. At the same time, the Allied supply of aluminum, aviation fuel, and industrial equipment complemented Soviet production, widening the gap with Germany. The volume of armored vehicles produced throughout the entire war showed a significant contrast. While Germany manufactured approximately 49,900 fully tracked vehicles, the Soviets produced around 99,150, in addition to the vehicles received via Lend-Lease. This volume allowed the Red Army to absorb losses at a rate that, according to OKH analysis, would have been prohibitive for any Western European power. Although internal studies recognized that Allied losses in armored vehicles were greater than the German ones, the replacement capacity completely altered the strategic implications of these proportions. American naval production reflected an industrial capacity on a scale that surpassed any German effort. In 1943, the United States launched more than 11 million tons of merchant shipping, a figure that vastly exceeded the Axis's capacity to sink ships using submarines. American factories adopted mass production methods that extended their benefits to the manufacturing of weapons, vehicles, and airplanes. Companies like Ford Motor Company applied assembly techniques that allowed the manufacturing of a vehicle in just over 1 minute. This industrial volume had to be evaluated, along with the fact that unemployment in the United States fell to 1.9% in 1945, reflecting the complete labor mobilization. The Allied bombings added significant pressure to German production. The British and American air forces intensified attacks both on industrial centers and on critical infrastructure. The British Area Bombing Directive of February 1942 expanded the range of targets and increased the pace of nighttime attacks. The USAF, for its part, carried out precision daytime attacks against bearing factories, refineries, and transportation centers. Together, the Allies carried out more than 1 million bombing missions and dropped more than 1 million tons of bombs on German targets. These attacks reduced tank production by 10% in 1943 and by 40% in 1944. In specific sectors like synthetic oil, the impacts were greater. The OKW reports recorded recurring disruptions that directly affected the mobility of the armed forces. The measures to disperse industrial production in order to mitigate damage caused a decrease in efficiency. The relocation of factories to underground or distant locations created transportation and coordination problems. The partial destruction of railways, stations, and logistical depots interfered with the flow of materials. These accumulated interruptions reduced Germany's ability to sustain even the minimum levels of production, especially in fuels and ammunition. The structural difficulties in the procurement system deepened these problems. The interference of the Nazi Party in the awarding of contracts introduced criteria unrelated to industrial efficiency. Companies with proven experience in mass production were not always selected. Tank manufacturers were working with artisanal processes that limited standardization and the pace of assembly. In the aeronautics industry, the reliance on forced and foreign workers was growing, but this unskilled labor generated quality problems. In companies like Heinkel, more than half of the workforce in 1944 consisted of forced workers, which made it difficult to form a stable technical staff. Inefficient administrative decisions added additional delays. A documented example was the 1943 instruction for Henschel to adapt their production lines to a new heavy fighter, a task that involved reconfiguring machinery and processes. Before completing this transition, the order was cancelled, and they were instructed to return to the production of the Ju-88. These back and forths meant loss of time at a moment when Germany needed to urgently increase air production. Productivity reports recorded declines in critical sectors associated with these decisions. The High Command integrated this industrial data with operational assessments of the battlefronts. The figures of production and loss were part of technical discussions about the feasibility of campaigns. Even at times when the Wehrmacht achieved tactical victories, calculations showed that the pace of attrition in men and equipment exceeded the replacement capacity. The Ministry of Armaments recorded that each reduction in production, whether due to bombings or administrative interruptions, translated into deficits that would immediately affect operational capacity. The perception of the conflict as a process of irreversible material attrition was consolidated in the reports of 1943 and 1944. The data showed that the Reich could not increase production to levels comparable to those of the Allies, and that the gap would continue to widen. The volume of tanks, airplanes, and ammunition available at the fronts depended on an industrial system that had started the war unprepared for a prolonged effort. Although Speer's reforms increased efficiency, they failed to reverse a global trend stemming from both internal limitations and the sustained pressure of Allied attacks. OKW reports documented that the combination of accumulated losses, consumption on multiple fronts, and limited production capacity led to a scenario in which the war could no longer be sustained materially, even if the Wehrmacht retained the capacity to achieve tactical victories in isolated sectors. Intelligence and decryption. The invisible war lost. While the land fronts occupied most of the attention in the daily reports of the German High Command, a silent but decisive process was unfolding in parallel: the continuous erosion of informational advantage. During the early years of the war, the Wehrmacht had relied on its ability to operate quickly, combined with an encrypted communication system considered inviolable, to impose its own strategic pace. However, by 1943, the reality was beginning to become evident to the officers responsible for communication security and signal analysis. The Reich was being systematically surpassed in the intelligence war, and this defeat was manifesting in two complementary dimensions. On the one hand, the German codes were being read regularly by the Allies. On the other, Allied cryptographic systems were becoming increasingly inaccessible to the German decryption capabilities. This double loss, although less visible than the operational defeats in Africa, the Mediterranean, or the Eastern Front, had effects as decisive as the destruction of entire divisions in combat. The core of this situation was the Enigma encryption device, used by all German armed branches since before the war. Enigma, originally a commercial product, employed a series of rotors that modified the electrical path generated by each keystroke. The result was a complex substitution that varied with each character typed. The possible combinations, which included rotor selection and position, plug board settings, and daily configurations, seemed to guarantee absolute security according to German evaluations. This perception led to a remarkable degree of institutional trust. In the months leading up to the invasion of Poland, the Wehrmacht had deployed more than 100,000 Enigma machines, convinced that their communication system was impenetrable even in the face of considerable technical efforts. However, the scenario was different from what the German planners assumed. Since 1932, a small group of Polish mathematicians from the Bureau Cyfrów, led by Marian Rejewski, had managed to break the encryption in its initial form. Using combinations of mathematical theory, statistical analysis, and documentation provided by French intelligence, they succeeded in partially reproducing the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors, allowing encrypted messages to be interpreted. Facing the imminent threat of invasion, the Poles shared their discoveries with the British and French in July of 1939. This act, motivated by clear strategic considerations, allowed the British to organize a decryption program that would quickly surpass the previous capabilities of the Polish services. The United Kingdom institutionalized this work at Bletchley Park, where an interdisciplinary team of mathematicians, linguists, statistics specialists, radio operators, and technical staff was assembled. Unlike previous artisanal methods, the British transformed cryptography into a semi-industrial process. Electromechanical devices known as bombs were built, which detected plausible Enigma configurations through repetitive test and discard operations. The work led by Alan Turing and other specialists developed more advanced procedures that allowed reading German traffic from very early stages of the war. By the end of 1940, Luftwaffe messages were routinely deciphered, those of the Army, with some delay, and those of the Navy, although more difficult due to the use of stricter procedures, would begin to be vulnerable due to operational errors and material captures. British success also depended on deficiencies in German operational discipline. The structure of Enigma required operators to apply exact configurations and change procedures regularly. Nevertheless, many messages contained repeated phrases or predictable structures, which made it easier to generate starting points for analysis. Additionally, German units did not always change keys as frequently as stipulated. The British analysts, supported by systematic interceptions, took advantage of these inconsistencies to speed up decryption. By early 1941, the Ultra program was regularly reading German air and ground communications, providing immediate information about movements, orders, and deployments. The capture of physical material further accelerated the process. In May of 1941, after the combat against U-110, British forces managed to recover a naval Enigma machine, along with operation codes, signal tabulations, and procedure manuals. This event allowed for the systematic deciphering of U-boat traffic, which had direct implications for the Battle of the Atlantic. From then on, the British Naval Intelligence Centre frequently received the approximate position of German submarines and was able to coordinate convoys to minimize encounters. Combined with improvements in radar, sonar, and air capacity, this access contributed to a significant reduction in Allied losses and a progressive increase in German losses. The Kriegsmarine attempted to increase security by introducing an additional rotor in specific variants of Enigma. This modification produced a period during which naval messages could not be read by the Allies. However, the recovery of new codes through capture operations and the construction of faster bombs by the US Navy restored the ability to decipher messages in December of 1942. When this occurred, the Allies had acquired considerable operational capability to intercept and neutralize groups of U-boats before they could attack convoys. In June of 1943, for example, an ultra message indicated the formation of a German patrol line composed of 17 submarines intended to disrupt traffic between North America and Gibraltar. The convoys were diverted by alternative routes, and no confrontation occurred in that sector during the entire month. The operational value of Ultra lay in its ability to provide the Allies with advanced knowledge of German plans. This included movements of armoured units in North Africa, bombing patterns assigned to the Luftwaffe, and reconfigurations in the Atlantic coastal defence. Although Allied commanders rarely knew the exact source of certain reports due to strict compartmentalization measures, the information generated by Ultra contributed to operational decisions that significantly reduced the German tactical advantages. The existence of cover stories, such as reconnaissance flights or circumstantial findings, ensured that the source of the knowledge remained hidden and that the Germans did not suspect their cryptographic system had been compromised. As the Allies managed to decipher German communications more and more efficiently, German decryption capabilities faced structural limitations. The B-Dienst, the German naval intelligence, achieved some major successes. Under the direction of Wilhelm Trano, it had broken British naval codes as early as the 1930s. At the start of the war, it could read part of the British communications regarding ship positions. In 1942, it deciphered the Naval Cipher No. 3, which allowed for anticipating convoy movements and improving the effectiveness of U-boat attacks in early stages of the campaign. German access to these communications was progressively reduced as the Allies improved their procedures. The introduction of Naval Cipher No. 5 in June of 1943 eliminated the B-Dienst's ability to read critical communications. The adoption of Typex machines with internal complexities comparable to or greater than Enigma and disciplined procedures further reduced opportunities for decryption. By the end of 1943, most Allied naval traffic was inaccessible to German attempts. The German institutional fragmentation prevented efficient coordination of cryptographic efforts. There was no central agency comparable to Bletchley Park. Instead, multiple entities operated with partial responsibility. OKW for the Wehrmacht, sections of the Army, Air Force and Navy, as well as units within Abwehr and the Reich Main Security Office. The lack of coordination caused duplication of efforts, loss of information, and absence of a unified line of development. Although some isolated achievements, such as the interception of encrypted telephone communications between Roosevelt and Churchill through installations in the occupied Netherlands, demonstrated technical capability, these successes did not compensate for the general deterioration. The qualitative difference between the systems was continuously widening. The Allies operated with disciplined procedures, frequently updated codes, and had resources to build advanced cryptographic devices. Germany maintained an excessive confidence in a system whose security depended on both design and operational discipline, a discipline that was rarely uniform among its units. Reports on communication vulnerabilities sent to the High Command in 1943 indicated that the Allies had a wide window into German operations in multiple theatres. At the same time, the volume of useful information that Germany was able to obtain was steadily decreasing. At the operational level, the consequence was clear. The Allies could anticipate German movements, while Germany operated with incomplete knowledge of its adversaries' plans and communications. This directly affected the ability to react with strategic precision in campaigns where time and movement determined success. As Allied operations gained scale and coordination, the loss of informational advantage increasingly limited the German ability to adapt its forces, the obedience that survived hope. As the war progressed and the German strategic situation visibly deteriorated on all fronts, the internal analyses of the High Command began to show a significant contrast between what professional officers assessed as operational reality and what the political leadership demanded. During 1943 and 1944, the information accumulated by the various planning offices and field commands indicated unambiguously that Germany no longer had the resources, time, or initiative needed to alter the course of the conflict. The combination of attrition on the Eastern Front, loss of maritime control in the Atlantic, reduction of productive capacity due to Allied bombings, and the growing enemy material superiority had created a scenario where a return to strategic equilibrium was impossible. However, this technical knowledge did not translate into an institutional break of the military apparatus with the regime. The contrast between professional assessment and political obedience remained constant, and the ability to convert objective analyses into state decisions was nullified by the structure of the Third Reich's system of government. One of the earliest antecedents of this tension occurred in 1938, when the chief of the Army General Staff, Ludwig Beck, opposed Hitler's plan to invade Czechoslovakia, even though it might entail the risk of war with powers such as France, Great Britain, or the Soviet Union. Beck argued that Germany was not prepared for a large-scale conflict and that the strategy led to a lost war. Unable to influence political direction, he resigned from his position without his warning, generating an organic response within the military command. This initial episode illustrated a structural problem. The more experienced officers could identify serious strategic risks, but they lacked institutional mechanisms to curb political decisions that contradicted technical assessments. The trend intensified after the defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943. Reports from the Security Service, SD, led by Otto Ohlendorf, documented a widespread deterioration in civilian morale and in the popular perception of the regime's ability to win the war. These reports, prepared with systematic surveillance methods, showed that military defeats, the increase in casualties, the effects of rationing, and the rise in Allied bombings had drastically reduced confidence in the political leadership. By the end of 1943, even Heinrich Himmler acknowledged that the majority of the population no longer believed a German victory was possible. However, the state's repressive apparatus prevented this change in public opinion from transforming into organized action. The Gestapo, supported by a system of administrative and police surveillance, neutralized any attempt at collective opposition. Examples of protest, like the Rosenstrasse case, demonstrated that a certain degree of visible resistance was possible, but did not provide a framework for a national mobilization. Within the army, the resistance was organized into small groups without broad coordination capability. Its members agreed that Hitler's leadership was leading the country to an irreversible disaster, but they faced severe limitations: monitored communications, risk of reprisals against family members, and the hierarchical structure of the army that demanded strict obedience. Military resistance to the regime focused on individuals or small circles trying to persuade high-ranking officers to organize a coup. Between late 1943 and mid-1944, various attempts were made to approach Hitler in which conspirators sought to position themselves close enough to use explosives or handguns. Axel von dem Busche, a member of the Infantry Regiment 9, prepared an attack using hand grenades during a winter uniform presentation scheduled for November of 1943. The plan depended on a demonstration that would allow him to physically approach the Führer, but the train transporting the uniforms was destroyed by bombings and the event was cancelled. A similar attempt scheduled for December was also thwarted when Hitler changed his itinerary and moved the meeting to another location. Von dem Busche again offered his participation in an attack in January of 1944, but shortly before he lost a leg in combat, leaving him out of action. Other conspirators attempted similar approaches. Ewald Heinrich von Kleist was considered for an attack in February of 1944, but the event that would have allowed his approach was cancelled unexpectedly. In March, Eberhard von Breitenbuch attempted to kill Hitler during a meeting scheduled at the Berghof, carrying a small-caliber pistol hidden in his clothing, but he was prevented from entering the premises where the conference was taking place. Many of these attempts did not fail due to lack of determination, but because of the constant changes in Hitler's routines and the strict security measures surrounding him. The most developed plot was that of the 20th of July of 1944. Its organizers sought to employ Operation Valkyrie, a plan originally designed to maintain order in the event of internal uprisings or administrative collapse. Under the original drafting, Valkyrie allowed the reserve army to be mobilized to secure critical infrastructure within the German territory. General Friedrich Olbricht proposed adapting the plan to initiate a coup d'état once Hitler had been eliminated. The objective was to activate Valkyrie immediately after the assassination, before the SS or the Gestapo could react. For the plan to work, General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the reserve army, had to be incorporated or neutralized. Fromm was aware of the existence of conspirators, but avoided taking an open stance, waiting for the outcome of any attempt before committing himself. Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, who had suffered severe injuries during the campaign in North Africa and had lost an eye, his right hand, and part of the left, became the central figure of the plot. His position as Chief of Staff of the replacement army allowed him to have access to meetings with Hitler. In the absence of candidates capable of getting close enough to the Führer to carry out an attack, Stauffenberg assumed the role of executor. On the 20th of July 1944, he attended a meeting at the Wolf's Lair, the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia. The original plan assumed that the meeting would take place in a reinforced underground bunker, whose concrete walls would have concentrated the bomb's shockwave. However, due to the heat, the meeting was moved to a wooden conference room on the surface. Stauffenberg placed a briefcase with an explosive device under the table and left the room claiming a telephone call. The bomb exploded at 12:42. Stauffenberg, observing the explosion from a distance, assumed that Hitler had died and travelled immediately to Berlin to start the subsequent phase of the coup. But the explosion did not have the expected effect. A staff member had moved the briefcase behind a solid wood support, which drastically reduced the impact force on Hitler. Although 4 people died and several were injured, Hitler survived with minor injuries. The delay in confirming the Führer's status proved fatal for the conspirators. In Berlin, the execution of Valkyrie depended on a chain of orders that many officers hesitated to activate without absolute confirmation. When Stauffenberg arrived hours later, the information about Hitler's survival had already spread. General Fromm, seeking to ensure his own position, ordered the arrest of the leaders present in the Bendler block. That same night, he organized a summary court-martial and ordered the immediate execution of Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Merz von Quernheim, and von Haften, who tried to protect Stauffenberg by placing himself between him and the firing squad. In the following days, the repression spread rapidly. The Gestapo identified and arrested hundreds of suspects. Many were subjected to severe interrogations, and the trials of the Volksgerichtshof, presided over by Roland Freisler, were characterized by summary procedures and death sentences. Between August of 1944 and the first months of 1945, thousands of people were detained on suspicion of links to the conspiracy or for expressing opinions contrary to the regime. Close to 200 direct or indirect participants in the plot were executed. Even high-ranking figures such as Wilhelm Canaris, Henning von Treschow, Julius Leber, and Karl Goerdeler were eventually arrested and executed. The repression of those involved in the plot demonstrated that the state control structure continued to function at full capacity, even when the military situation was deteriorating irreversibly. The failure of the July 20th plot eliminated any possibility of a coordinated uprising within the army. Hitler replaced numerous commanders and increased ideological pressure within the armed forces. In the following months, measures to ensure political obedience intensified. Heinz Guderian, appointed Chief of Staff after the plot, demanded the resignation of any officer who did not fully support the regime. The Army Court of Honor expelled hundreds of officers suspected of lacking political loyalty, transferring them to the jurisdiction of Freisler's courts. The combination of internal purification and judicial repression further reduced any room for independent action within the High Command. The structure that prevented officials from acting against Hitler had been established years before through the personal oath of allegiance to the Führer. This oath, required since 1934, directly linked the soldier to Hitler, not to the German state. As the war progressed, this bond acquired a weight beyond symbolism. Its violation implied severe punishments and, in many cases, reprisals against entire families. The presence of this legal and ideological mechanism, along with the surveillance of the Nazi Party in all military institutions, neutralized any initiative for open opposition. Even among those who considered the continuation of the war unsustainable, the fear of state repression was enough to inhibit collective actions. In the middle of 1944, when the American and British forces were advancing from the west and the Red Army was penetrating deeply into European territory from the east, the German military resistance acquired a distinct character. Many of the remaining conspirators no longer believed a political change was possible to ensure a future for Germany. Their objective, at this late stage, focused on limiting the country's destruction and avoiding, as much as possible, a total collapse of civil order. This motivation, even being pragmatic, could not overcome the structural obstacles that defined the Nazi command system. The conspirators operated within an environment where communication was dangerous, coordination was limited, and collective action was almost impossible. The central element that defined the internal fracture of the German High Command during the last years of the war was the coexistence of two irreconcilable realities. On one hand, the professional officers had enough information to know that defeat was inevitable. On the other, the structure of the Nazi state prevented that knowledge from translating into effective political or military change. The combination of oaths of loyalty, constant surveillance, repressive mechanisms, and the fragmentation of the few resistance groups created an environment in which institutional obedience was maintained even when the chain of technical analysis showed clearly that the war was lost. The result was a military apparatus that continued executing orders while its professional leadership understood that there was no realistic way to alter the course of the conflict.